Welcome to Unit 2 of the CLPNM's 2023 Annual Professional Learning Module. This unit will provide you with an introduction to the Regulated Health Professions Act. The RHPA is umbrella legislation for Manitoba's many regulated health professions. Until recently, each regulated health profession had its own governing act in Manitoba, and each of those acts was amended at different times. This led to inconsistency in the rules for health professions over time. The RHPA came into effect in 2014. However, the province is bringing each profession under the RHPA in sequence, not all at one time. Today, the RHPA applies to speech-language pathologists and audiologists, registered nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, physicians, and paramedics. The practical nursing profession will be one of the next professions to transition to the RHPA. As noted in Unit 1 of this module, the CLPNM expects the transition to happen sometime before the end of 2024. We do not have a confirmed date. The RHPA was introduced to create more consistent rules and processes across regulated health professions. Other goals of the RHPA are to acknowledge overlapping scopes of practice, enhance patient safety, and increase the accountability of regulatory bodies to the public they serve. Since the RHPA will apply to all regulated healthcare professions in Manitoba, any statements or rules that are specific to an individual profession will be found in the supporting regulations. Under the RHPA, there will be two regulations specific to the practical nursing profession: the Practice of Practical Nursing Regulation and the College of Licensed Practical Nurses Manitoba General Regulation. As a CLPNM registrant, it is not important for you to know today which requirements or authorities will be found in which regulation. Just note that you may find the CLPNM referring to or quoting two separate regulations in future when we communicate with you about specific requirements that apply to your registration and your practice. As the RHPA takes effect for your profession, there will be several changes, but many things will stay the same. The RHPA will continue the college's duty and authority to regulate the profession in the public interest. This means that all CLPNM decisions will continue to be made to serve and protect the public. Registrants are important stakeholders of the college, and the CLPNM has a duty to be fair to its registrants, but CLPNM does not represent the interests of its registrants. This will not change under the RHPA. Advancing the interests of the profession is the role of unions and professional associations. Professional self-regulation will also continue under the RHPA. This means that each profession will continue to have a regulatory body that is a separate legal entity from government. Each regulatory body will be governed by a council comprised of both members of the profession and members of the public. Title protection will also continue under the RHPA. Title protection refers to restricting the use of certain titles to the health professionals who are authorized to use them. Examples of protected titles are Licensed Practical Nurse and LPN. Like today under the LPN Act, no person will be authorized to use either title under the RHPA unless they hold both registration and a valid certificate of practice from the CLPNM. Although there will be some changes in registration processes and requirements, which will be discussed later on in this unit, the general requirement to become registered before practicing a regulated profession and to renew the authorization to practice each year will also continue under the RHPA. The college's role related to complaints will also continue. This role includes accepting complaints about the conduct or competence of practical nurses, investigating those complaints, and rendering decisions which might include making a referral for professional discipline when warranted. And under the RHPA, the CLPNM, like all health regulatory bodies in Manitoba, will continue to have the responsibility to operate a continuing competence program to monitor the practice of the profession. For some regulatory bodies that have governing legislation much older than the LPN Act, this may be a change. However, for the CLPNM, which has operated a continuing competence program since 2001, this obligation will be ongoing. From a registrant perspective, much will stay the same when the RHPA takes effect for your profession. However, there will be changes that will impact how we communicate with you, how your profession's scope of practice is defined and described, the governance of your regulatory body, some of your requirements during the annual renewal process, your professional responsibilities, and your practice. The changes you will need to be aware of fall into the categories noted here. In the next few slides, we will take a closer look. The RHPA changes some of the language that is used in the regulation of your profession, so you will hear us use different terms and phrases in the coming year. For example, the CLPNM Board of Directors, which is the governing body for the organization, will become the CLPNM Council. Your annual authorization to practice will be referred to as a certificate of practice. You will renew your certificate of practice, not your registration each year. You will still hear us talk about your registration, but the term registration will refer to your initial enrollment with the CLPNM as an LPN. Under the RHPA, the Investigation Committee will be the Complaints Investigation Committee, and the Discipline Committee will be the Inquiry Committee. The roles and authority of each committee will be largely unchanged. In regulations under the RHPA, there will continue to be a statement describing the scope of practice of your profession, but the description will be updated. The revised scope of practice statement, which will eventually appear in regulations under the RHPA, is not yet approved by government, so it is not yet ready to share publicly. We expect that it will clarify that the practice of practical nursing includes multiple domains of nursing, such as education and administration, in addition to clinical care. The scope of practice statement will reflect the breadth of the profession in Manitoba and recognize that Manitoba's practical nurses have the foundations necessary for practice in a wide range of roles. This won't change the scope of the profession, but will better describe the existing scope. Once a revised scope of practice statement is approved by government, it will be communicated to registrants and stakeholders. As the CLPNM transitions to the RHPA, you may also notice some changes in the governance of the organization. Today, the CLPNM has a board of directors comprised of 12 members, 7 of whom are LPNs and 5 of whom are public representatives. As mentioned previously, the board of directors will be referred to as the CLPNM Council under the RHPA, although its role will remain largely the same. What will change are the size and the composition of the council. The RHPA requires the CLPNM to re-examine its governance. The CLPNM Board of Directors has made the decision to transition to a council of 10 members with equal public and LPN representation. All council members, except for the few who are appointed by the Minister of Health, will be appointed by the council using a competency-based appointment process. If you are a registrant who doesn't get involved in the governance of your profession, you may wonder why this matters. Many regulatory bodies are moving toward equal public and professional representation on their governing councils. This ties in with the RHPA's goal of increasing regulatory accountability. Cooperation between members of the profession and the public on the governing council of a regulatory body supports accountability to the public and can help a regulatory body maintain its focus on its public protection mandate. An equal split of public and LPN members on the governing council will help to ensure that professional knowledge continues to inform decisions about your profession, while also ensuring that the governing council has access to a broader range of competencies and can benefit from more diverse perspectives. While these changes are prompted in part by the CLPNM's transition to the RHPA, they will appear in the bylaws of the college. Each year, the LPNs who participate in the annual general meeting of the college have an opportunity to vote to confirm or vary any of the bylaws of the college, with the exception of bylaws pertaining to the fees required for registration, certificates of practice, and health profession corporation permits. If you're wondering what a health profession corporation permit is, that will be covered in a later slide. As a CLPNM registrant, you might not notice many changes to your annual requirements for renewal in the coming years. This is in part because the CLPNM has begun introducing some of the changes required by the RHPA already. The changes noted on this slide have already been implemented or in the process of being implemented in 2023. These changes include requesting updated criminal record and abuse registry checks at least every 5 years. The CLPNM refers to these checks collectively as suitability checks. All regulatory bodies will be required to implement a similar requirement as they come under the RHPA. To set the college up for future compliance with the RHPA, the CLPNM initiated this process 6 years ago. These changes also include modified continuing competence requirements. We will discuss the new CCP in more detail in Unit 4 of this module. These changes also include updating the window for submitting a complete application for the renewal of your certificate of practice. The CLPNM has made adjustments to the application window this year in 2023. The application window will be timed in a way that will ensure that the CLPNM has enough time to process applications before LPN's certificates of practice expire. LPNs will continue to have over 7 weeks in which to submit a complete renewal application before late fees apply. If you are wondering what the renewal dates are for this year, please check the CLPNM website for more information. Regulations under the RHPA are expected to require all LPNs and GPNs to hold a minimum of $5 million in liability protection from the Canadian Nurse Protective Society, also known as CNPS. This is the same body that provides liability protection for Manitoba's registered nurses and registered psychiatric nurses. The CLPNM is implementing this change for the 2024 registration year. This was communicated to all registrants in January of 2023. More information on this can also be found on the CLPNM website. As professions transition to the RHPA, the government is taking a special interest in the practice standards that each regulatory body sets for its registrants. Government has identified certain topics which must be addressed in each profession's standards or practice, including patient-centered care, collaborative care, competent practice, record keeping, safe practice environments and equipment, and standards specific to self-employed practices, such as requirements related to closing or leaving a business. Portions of the standards will also be incorporated into each profession's regulations, which means that they will be subject to government's review and approval. CLPNM registrants are aware that the CLPNM implemented new standards of practice and conduct in 2021 in anticipation of the RHPA. Most of the standards required for the RHPA were incorporated into the new standards adopted in 2021. This means there will not be many changes to the standards as we transition to the RHPA. There will be some additional requirements for self-employed practices, however. It is also possible that the standards will need to be revised to include new requirements specific to the performance of reserved acts. Reserved acts will be discussed in Unit 3 of this module. Keep your eyes open for CLPNM announcements on revised standards to address these topics in the coming months. The RHPA also includes broader obligations for professionals to report circumstances that might place the public at risk. These changes will help to strengthen public protection, which you will remember is one of the goals of the Act. Under the RHPA, employers will be required by law to report to the college when a practical nurse has been terminated or suspended from their employment. Under the current LPN Act, employers are only obliged to report terminations. For LPNs, the duty to report will also be expanded in law to include reporting members of other health professions with whom the practical nurse practices in association, if the practical nurse believes the other professional is unfit to practice or is suffering from a physical or mental condition or disorder that may place the public at risk if their practice is not restricted. The term practicing in association refers to an agreement between professionals to share operating costs of a business, such as the costs of rent, staff, and equipment. As such, this expanded duty to report in law might be most applicable to LPNs who practice in a self-employed capacity and in the private sector. However, note that there has long been an expectation set out in the CLPNM Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice to take appropriate action to safeguard individuals, families, and communities, including reporting to the applicable authorities when a person's health is endangered by a coworker or any other person. Given this, the expanded duty to report in the RHPA will serve to strengthen a requirement that already exists in the CLPNM standards and code. If you feel unsure of your professional responsibilities related to the duty to report, please be sure to review the CLPNM's Duty to Report interpretive document. Like all resources discussed in this learning module, it is available on the CLPNM website. The RHPA also strengthens each registrant's duty to meet their professional obligations. In doing so, the RHPA will strengthen the CLPNM's powers of enforcement. These changes, like many of the changes in the RHPA, have been introduced to strengthen public protection. Section 86 of the RHPA makes it even more explicit that practical nurses must comply with the Act, regulations, bylaws, standards of practice, code of ethics, and practice directions of their profession. A breach of any of these becomes a breach of the Act itself. Remember the regulatory framework we covered in Unit 1 of this module? This is a section of law that will make it even more clear that, as a practical nurse, you must operate within that regulatory framework. The RHPA allows members of regulated health professions to carry on the practice of that profession as a corporation. However, they may only do so if they have obtained a permit from the CLPNM. These permits are referred to as Health Profession Corporation permits. The corporation must also meet other requirements specified in the RHPA and the regulations. For example, a health profession corporation must not carry on any business or activity other than the practice of the regulated health profession. The CLPNM does not provide advice on whether it is advisable or advantageous from a business perspective for an LPN to incorporate and then to seek a permit to practice as a corporation. This advice will need to be obtained from legal counsel and/or a professional accountant. The CLPNM's role will be to vet applications for permits when an LPN has made the decision that incorporating is something the LPN wishes to pursue. The CLPNM will review the proposed name of the corporation before granting a permit to make sure it is not misleading and to ensure that it clarifies for the public that the corporation is one that practices within the scope of practical nursing. It is important for LPNs to be aware that practicing as a corporation will not have any bearing on the LPN's responsibility to meet their professional obligations as an LPN. Section 64 of the RHPA states that an LPN must comply with the Act and the regulations, bylaws, standards of practice, code of ethics, and practice directions for their profession, despite any relationship they may have with a corporation. More information about the process to apply to the CLPNM for a health profession corporation permit and about the obligations of those who hold permits will be published as the CLPNM continues its work on the RHPA transition. The RHPA also introduces the concept of reserved acts, which are restricted healthcare activities. The Act states that no person shall perform a reserved act in the course of providing healthcare unless that reserved act is authorized for their profession and for the individual healthcare provider. The introduction of reserved acts is one of the more significant changes associated with the RHPA. They will be discussed in more detail in Unit 3. Before we move on to Unit 3, let's consider a few scenarios that might help you reflect on your professional responsibilities as a practical nurse once your profession transitions to the RHPA. Maureen, an LPN, owns and operates her own aesthetic nursing business. Although she practices as a separate legal entity from her colleagues, she collaborates closely with an authorized prescriber, and they are co-located in the same clinic space. Maureen has heard from other self-employed nurses that there are benefits to forming a health profession corporation. After consulting with her lawyer and accountant and gathering a better understanding of business reasons to incorporate, she decides that incorporating might indeed make sense for her. She understands that in order to practice as a corporation, she will need to incorporate and obtain a permit from the CLPNM. She assumes that practicing as a corporation will help protect her in the event that a complaint about her services is made to the CLPNM by a client who is dissatisfied with the results of an aesthetic nursing treatment. Is Maureen making a correct assumption? No. As we reviewed earlier in this unit, practicing as a health profession corporation has no bearing on Maureen's professional accountability as an LPN. Maureen must comply with the Act and the regulations, bylaws, standards of practice, code of ethics, and practice directions for her profession, despite any relationship she has with a corporation. In the event that the CLPNM receives a complaint about Maureen's practice, the fact that she practices her profession as a corporation will not interfere with the CLPNM's authority to investigate the complaint, and if there were reason to be concerned about her competence or conduct, it would not interfere with the CLPNM's authority to hold her accountable to her standards. Jenny was educated as a practical nurse and worked for several years as an LPN. This year, she did not renew her certificate of practice because she decided to take time away from work to care for her family. Jenny is asked to be a guest speaker at her child's high school during the school's career fair. The school principal knows that Jenny was an LPN and wants her to talk to the kids about being a nurse. Can Jenny or the principal tell the kids and their parents that Jenny is an LPN? It is great that Jenny wants to speak with pride about her rewarding career as an LPN. However, Jenny must be careful not to refer to herself using the protected title of Licensed Practical Nurse or LPN because she does not hold a current certificate of practice. She also must not imply that she is currently an LPN. Under the RHPA, like today under the LPN Act, the title of Licensed Practical Nurse or LPN is a protected title. It is protected for those who are currently authorized to practice the profession. Jenny has several other options. She can say she used to be an LPN and can say she was educated in nursing. She can also say that she has a diploma in practical nursing, referring specifically to her educational credential. Raven, LPN, is the new owner and administrator of a nursing agency. She is confident that her nursing knowledge will help her in this role. The agency is extremely busy, and Raven has added many new facility contracts. Raven feels fortunate that she can provide so many LPNs to the many facilities that are requesting them. To meet the demand for LPNs, Raven has engaged every LPN who has applied to the agency, and sometimes has not had time to check to ensure that each LPN has a valid certificate of practice. She also hasn't consistently checked to see whether any of the LPNs she has engaged have conditions limiting their certificates of practice. The agency has been so busy that some LPNs start working the next day following their interviews. Raven regularly offers overtime to whoever will accept it. Raven feels lucky she has only received one complaint from a facility regarding an LPN from her agency. The allegations were pretty concerning, so Raven stopped offering the LPN shifts through her agency. Since the LPNs she engages are not considered employees for tax purposes, she did not consider it her responsibility to address the concerns with the LPN, nor did she consider it her responsibility to report the concerns to the CLPNM. Under the RHPA, will Raven's work in an administrative capacity be subject to the standards of the LPN profession, even though she is not providing clinical care herself? Is Raven administering the agency according to her responsibilities under the RHPA? Raven is a regulated professional, and as such, she must adhere to the standards of practice and conduct of her profession, as well as to the applicable legislation. Raven practices practical nursing in the domain of administration. Administration is included in the scope of practice of the profession. This fact is expected to be clarified and made more explicit in the revised scope of practice statement that will be added to regulations when the profession comes under the RHPA. Raven is subject to her standards, but it is not clear that she is meeting them, nor is it clear that she would be meeting her obligations under the RHPA in future. According to Section 167 of the RHPA, a person who employs or engages another person to provide health care as a member of a regulated health profession must ensure that the other person is registered and holds a valid certificate of practice issued under this Act during the period of employment or engagement. This section of the RHPA explicitly extends beyond an employee-employer relationship. It covers any person who might engage a regulated health professional to practice their profession. Also, under Section 168 of the RHPA, if a person employs or engages a health professional to provide health care in any capacity, including as an employee, contractor, or consultant, and suspends or terminates the employment or engagement of the health professional for misconduct, incompetence, or incapacity, then that person must promptly report the suspension or termination to the health professional's regulatory college and give the health professional a copy of the report. Finally, Section 169 of the RHPA states that no person who employs or engages a health professional shall knowingly permit the professional to fail to comply with a condition of the member's registration or certificate of practice. Raven could argue that by not checking the public register, she did not knowingly permit LPNs to practice contrary to the conditions on their certificates of practice. However, as a responsible professional, she should have checked the public register and therefore ought to have known. In this scenario, Raven has breached her professional standards as well as her obligations under the RHPA. Let's quickly summarize what we've covered in Unit 2. We've reviewed objectives of the RHPA and the intent to bring each health profession in Manitoba under the RHPA in sequence. We've talked about a number of things that will stay largely the same for your profession as it transitions to the RHPA. We've also talked about a number of things that will change as your profession comes under the RHPA. You will receive more information from the CLPNM on each of these changes as we come closer to the transition. This unit will give you foundational knowledge, or a frame of reference, to better understand the additional information on the RHPA you will receive from the CLPNM in the coming months and years. Now, move on to take a closer look at the reserved acts in Unit 3.